Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you. I need to start sharing my screen. So let me just find my presentation. I need to make it full screen. Okay, there we are. So Cybernetics and the Church of England. This is going to be based quite a lot on my recent PhD work. I mean, primarily on that. And I thought in order to enable you to kind of get a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from, I'd better say a little bit about myself at the beginning. So, first of all, I am a clergyman. I'm a priest in the Church of England. Quite a long spell, not in a parish post, but recently in a parochial situation as the priest in charge in Byfleet. I've also been a management consultant for 23 years, and actually that's how I met John and worked with John for a while at Telos Partners in Windsor, and then more recently we've just worked together on various projects. And actually it was his idea that in 2015 I commenced a part-time PhD, and I used it to explore the Church of England's National Renewal and Reform program. And of course, this brings together my my life as a priest and my life as a management consultant, because it's a program which has both theological and management elements. And I wanted to test its theological and organizational rationale. Did it add up? Did it make sense? And at the same time, I wished to demonstrate that the employment of organization theory had theological validity. You may possibly feel that's not an issue for you, or you didn't know it's an issue, but in the church, there is a considerable issue around whether the use of social science theory in general, but more specifically actually organization theory, is appropriate for the church, because it depends on what kind of thing the church is. To what extent is the Church of England an organization like others? And to what extent is it something that should be much more theologically defined and something really quite other? There's a whole debate about that, and that'll probably do on it for the moment. Now, the other part of my background is that I've worked with organizational cybernetics for many years, and doing so with John, to a lesser extent with Pete Dudley, but especially with John. And the trialogue developed from Beer's work by Pete Dudley and then taken on by John in the Intelligent Organization and the Intelligent Nation. I've been right at the center of that model. And I accept Mike Jackson's verdict that the VSM encapsulates a great deal of the best of other theories and can be combined effectively and appropriately with more people-orientated approaches. And in my thesis, I develop a form of the trialogue, which is combined with theological categories and makes some use of soft systems in particular. So it's not purely the cybernetic model, but the cybernetic model in conjunction with some other elements. And I think Mike Jackson is absolutely right that it combines well with a variety of approaches from a variety of sources. So I'll move on and talk to you a bit more now about the Church of England. So this is the situation which describes the Church of England, is the background to the Renewal and Reform program, which I was specifically investigating. And we know that the picture is one of what is often simply summarized as, quote, decline, unquote. So between 1979 and 2005, church Sunday attendance in England declined from 11.7% of the population to 6.3%, and that trend has continued to the present. There are now less than 3 million regular churchgoers. It's important to remember that in the 1940s, it may have been, you know, half of the population would have been going at least reasonably regularly to church. About 1/3 of this current church-going population attends Church of England services, so that's now well under 1 million people, and a high proportion are aged 50 plus. In 2000, a survey found that 58% of the population in Britain self-identify as religious or spiritual. A YouGov study in 2020 suggested that the no religion population, part of the population, is now a majority, 55%, and that belief in any form of God now less than 50%. So the trend is clear. There is a reducing identification with religion, and a dramatically reducing identification not only with the Church of England, but most forms of organized Christianity. Well, does that matter? You may well think it doesn't matter very much. You might welcome it if you're perhaps a humanist atheist of particular commitment to that point of view. You may think the church has not been a particularly healthy influence. And I'm certainly not here right now to defend the church's many failures or its sins of commission or omission. And in fact, I wouldn't deny them here or anywhere else. Nevertheless, I'm a Christian of orthodox theological convictions, and as a result, the decline of the church concerns me. And not just because I believe that the survival of Orthodox Christianity is quite tied in to the survival of the church as an institution. I'm not one of those who thinks that you can be a Christian without being engaged with the church. I think the institution and the theological reality as well of the church is something on which the Christian faith of individuals ultimately depends. However, I think all this matters from other perspectives. It is at the very least a matter of some interest and public concern, or should be. So we know, do we not, that we live in a society and culture shaped by Christianity, and for Christianity, or at least organized Christianity, to disappear in that culture signals a very significant shift. I want to argue as well, and this is the position taken by Holland in Dominion and also by David Bentley Hart in his book, which I cannot right now remember the title of, that some of the best things in our culture are in fact owed to Christianity. And that doesn't mean that the Christian institutions or Christian people have not behaved very badly at times, or been very retrogressive in their outlook. Of course they have. My own argument would be that these are features of the sinfulness of humanity shared by the church. But the point I want to make, particularly right now, is that some of the most important ideas and principles in our society, the value of everyone, for example, is essentially a Christian perspective. The role of the Church of England, more specifically in national identity and who we are in England in particular, is also something I would want to suggest is something we need to take seriously. And you can have a look at my vignette in John's Intelligent Nation on that. But here's something that's perhaps of broader interest. I mean, we do live in a divided society, racked, so it's said, by culture wars and other disagreements about quite fundamentally important things. Where are the safe spaces for discussion and the spiritual resources required for community building and reconciliation? I'm not sure that I know where they are if the church is not at least partly involved. And I know from experience that at the local level, the church is very positively regarded as a place which is able to host or provide a perspective on these considerations. In a society apparently retreating from the notion of public truth, where are the intellectual and other resources required for resistance? One of the reasons that I have come to really value being a parish priest after years of kind of avoiding it is because at a time where I see a lot of things happening in the public life of this country and elsewhere that I profoundly disagree with and regard as definitely retrograde, around truth, for example, around the turn to the right, for example, I think that one of the things I can most usefully do, one of the best opportunities I have, is to use my role as a parish priest to build a place within the community where the resources of the Christian tradition are used to encourage, to develop, and to strengthen the better things in our society. So I think it matters. You might not. But I think there are matters of interest here in relation to cybernetics, even if you don't. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Renewal and Reform. So this was a national program launched in 2015, designed and intended to support a new focus on numerical and spiritual growth. So the response of the church to decline was a program designed to nurture numerical and spiritual growth. Specifically, to seek an increase in the number of vocations to ministry, that is more vicars, particularly the ordained ministry, a targeting of funds to support growth and areas characterized by poverty and deprivation. Also, various reforms of a legal and procedural nature to make it easier for dioceses and parishes to be flexible and innovative in their approach, in their mission. A new leadership development program for bishops. This was because it was felt that bishops didn't understand how to be organizational leaders and how to develop strategy and vision for the church at a time when it needed to change. Probably true. Whether or not the leadership development program proposed was the right answer, another question. But a leadership development program, deans of cathedrals, but also more contentiously, a kind of talent pool for who would also be given special training at leadership development opportunities for those deemed to have potential to be senior leaders. So this is a kind of fast track development stream. This was particularly controversial because there is a kind of routine corporate attitude implied in all that, which a lot of people felt didn't sit very easily in the Church of England. And then a series of measures designed to encourage lay ministry by enabling lay people to be active disciples, active Christians in all parts of their lives. So that was the program launched in 2015. I wanted to know, how well did it stack up? I mean, if you look at the impact, it had generally, I mean, there were some positive notes in the reception of the program, of course, mostly from people who shared the kind of theological flavor which lies behind the program. I mean, that is evangelicals in the Church of England. There has certainly been some, but a more generally negative reception from the rest of the Church of England. Some success in recruiting clergy and allocating finance differently. I mean, so there are some quite good numbers around those factors, but decline continues in the sense that the graph shows a continuing and unchanged downward trend. And then, of course, COVID came along and arguably, well, not arguably, it has almost certainly intensified some of the decline factors, reduced. Most churches have experienced a further and quite dramatic decline in attendance post-COVID. So here are a few things to consider about renewal and reform, which emerged from my research, which, by the way, involved me analysing a set of documents which both underpinned and developed the programme, and also involved me interviewing one-to-one 15 major figures in the Church of England, most of them, a few critics, but mostly those who'd been actively involved in either designing or in promoting renewal and reform. And these were mostly very senior people, bishops and so forth. What came out was that the programme wasn't really owned outside of quite a small group. And actually, even those who were in it and owned it didn't seem to understand it all. One can talk about the extent to which it was governed and run and, in a sense, dictated by quite a small group. But actually, one of the things that emerges is it's quite possible that the group had no consistent governance at all, in the sense that you hear quite different things about it from people equally involved in it. And there is something there about the way the Church of England is set up and structured. And so the programme itself was highly influenced by the Church of England structure and by its politics and what was deemed possible. But actually, it seems to me that its implementation was also affected quite significantly by that structure and by the, well, more by the structure perhaps than by the politics. So let me just explain the structure. So you've got a national church, you've at the kind of top level, you've got dioceses with bishops running them in between, and then at the local, it's not quite as simple as this, but at the local level, you've got parishes with, vicars. Now, each level is highly independent. Parishes are highly independent. They depend primarily on volunteers who, as we know, are difficult to tell stuff. You've got to kind of win them. And dioceses are highly independent, and bishops are virtually impregnable. I mean, it's very difficult to get rid of a bishop. They'd have to do something really very bad indeed. And then it would be a long and difficult process. So these are highly independent levels and institutions within the institution, if you like. And even the national church has a bewildering series of institutional forms. General Synod, which is like the parliament of the church commissions, which controls the inherited money, the Archbishop's Council, which was the attempt to bring some of this together, actually, but it doesn't really quite do that. And there's Lambeth Palace, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury's kind of operation. So you've got, and it's really not clear who's in charge, who can ask what of whom, with an expectation that it will be done, etc. So this is why, you've got these kind of national initiatives such as Renewal and Reform, and they're really very, very loosely managed, in fact. So all this is going on in the Church of England. And part of what I was asking, and what I wanted to ask, was how might cybernetics help with this, given this kind of organization? And of course, my suggestion is that it would provide a much more systemic perspective and involve asking more fundamental, and one might say, paradoxically, more theological questions, because when you look at that list of factors in the church, and you look at what might be deemed to be possible in the church, and you look at the list of features of renewal and reform, what you seem to have is a set of initiatives in the kind of traditional classical organization theory style, which is both difficult to manage for a bureaucratic organization of the type the church has become, and especially difficult to do effectively in such a fractured bureaucratic organization, in which, you know, the kind of levers of power from top to bottom barely exist. So it seemed to me that something different is required, a more systemic perspective, yes, but one that absolutely asks more fundamental questions and has some hope of rallying people around a renewed sense of identity and purpose. So, and anyway, quite aside from the internal dynamics of the church, isn't it pretty obvious that with the church, one has to regain a sense of what the church is for, if one is to take it forward? Now, you might think that's a straightforward question with a straightforward answer, but I can assure you it is not. It is highly contested. And this is one of the areas where I found a soft systems perspective helpful. It is not that with the Church of England, one has a kind of, right, what's the purpose? Oh, right, there it is. All we need to do is reorientate the system around that purpose. No, there's a huge amount of debate and contestation around what that purpose is. So, I mean, and this is one of the reasons, of course, why the Church of England those leaders of renewal and reform kind of ducked the issue and, to the extent they were able to, impose their own solution, was because politically, the Church of England contains many different groups or factions, all with different perspectives on this question of purpose. And, you know, they've got names and societies, Anglo-Catholics, liberals, or broad church, evangelicals, and there, of course, are lots of subsets of all of those. So they felt that trying to answer that question was an impossible one. I think it may be difficult, but I'm not sure there's much choice if the Church of England is to be in any way sustained. And the other issue is what's going on in the environment. What might the church need to look like in the light of societal change? And this is a question that is simply not asked at all. In renewal and reform, they go straight from we haven't got enough people to we need more people. Let's get more people. Let's organize ourselves to get more people. There is no consideration of the question of why it might be that the Church of England has got to the point it's got to, and there is no consideration of what the Church of England might need to respond to in society in order to be more sustainable, more successful in the future. So I'm suggesting that cybernetics might help the church to ask better questions and go about addressing its plans for addressing its issues better in the future. But actually, I think also that cybernetics might offer a better way of thinking or dealing with these big structural issues. The way things are arises from a strange mix of traditionalism, you know, the type that Weber talked about, the local priest as part of a kind of feudal structure. So at the parish level, at the local church is very traditional still, I think, in its outlook and its attitudes. But especially over the last 150 years, above the parish, we've got an increasingly bureaucratic structure, both at the diocesan level and the national level. And as we know, that's quite good at kind of keeping things going as they are, but not so good at dealing with big challenges, big changes, and of the kind that has characterized our society. These two things don't fit together very well, or two. either, too. But perhaps we could look at this more differently. Instead of seeing it as a kind of block to change, perhaps the church's structure could be seen, at least to some degree, more positively, as perhaps an example of distributed authority, as an example perhaps of the kind of autonomy in the parts which something like the VSM values. Now, it may be overly so, but what we could perhaps do is, instead of trying to reform it structurally or take more control at the center, and that is very much the current direction of travel, more being done, more authority being taken at the center, perhaps we could focus less on hierarchies of status, authority, and so forth, and ask what kind of behavior we require of the leadership and management exercise by people at various levels. So there could be more of a kind of behavioral approach in which we ask ourselves, what is it appropriate to ask bishops to do? What is it appropriate to leave to people in parishes? What might the church at the center contribute to the discussion and to the planning? It seems to me that it's perfectly possible to have some kind of organized national conversation which might facilitate people contributing to the question of the future of the church from where they are, appropriately from where they are, and that a resulting strategy might have a much clearer sense of what the appropriate contribution of the people at the center, at the region, at the local, might contribute. So, for example, it seems to me perfectly reasonable to suggest that the primary job for those who are at the national level might be to provide the lead on telling the kind of story about the future, the story about the church's identity, the story about what's happening in the world, which might develop or suggest an overall narrative about the church's identity, direction, destination. And at the kind of diocesan level, bishops might be part of a conversation which is much more about what might that mean in our locality, in our region? What sort of things might that mean us thinking about and doing? And then at the local level, we might have a similar conversation about what might happen at the local parish level. And that would get us away from the kind of, tool-based, have one of these approach, which is what we tend to have now, and where there are kind of models knocking about that everybody's supposed to conform to, which bear no resemblance to the particular tradition of parts of the church, and which have no sense of belonging to a particular part of the church or geography or locality, which is wrong, not just, I think, cybernetically, but wrong because the Church of England is above all a local church. I'm nearly there. Let me just point out one or two ironies that the church might need to be reminded by cybernetics that role and status are not the same thing. In other words, being at the top does not mean that it's your job to boss everybody around. It just gives you a different viewpoint, and with the viewpoint, a different contribution. An irony too that a 15-year-old institution, and of course it's older depending on how you work it, might need to learn lessons in sustainability from a 50 to 60-year-old discipline. Maybe there's something to be learned from the church too. And does the church perhaps need to relearn some of its own lessons? There is some complexity here. I suppose that the point is that there are many affinities, in fact, between ideas found in cybernetics and those held dear in the church's traditions, only generally forgotten. For example, one of the better and more useful publications the church has made in the last 10 or 15 years is a document called Faithful Improvisation, published by the Church of England's Faith and Order Commission, in which it is argued that the church has generally changed in response to historical change by the ability to deeply inhabit its traditions in such a way as to allow it to reinterpret its activity appropriately in the light of new circumstances. That seems quite a lot like what the trialogue is saying, what Beer's meta-system was saying. And of course, the reason the church has had such a long life, aside, of course, I would argue as a Christian priest from the role of the Holy Spirit, but looking at it more, organizationally, it's got a lot, surely, to do with its powerful and enduring sense of purpose. And despite many failures in its actual performance with regard to love and justice, the value of all and so forth, there is what you might characterize as an ontological commitment underlying its devotion to those values. And that, to my mind, is something the church can offer the wider world. This sense of the ontological value of some of these things in an organizational world driven quite a lot by instrumental considerations. So we've got this theological and organizational paradox here that the organizational stuff is informed by theological ideas, and there's quite a lot of interesting writing on that. Organization theory is highly influenced by theological concepts. But on the other hand, the church seems to need to be reminded of its theological commitments by organization theory. And yet also, the church, I think, should be recognized as a source of, and underlying, I suppose, what I've just said, is a sense that the church can be regarded as, can be seen as a source of ideas and concepts. For example, the idea of leadership as service, which we stand deeply in need of today in our society. I guess I'll stop there with that affirmation of the value both to the church, but also to the wider society and wider organizational landscape of a collaboration between organizational and theological concepts, and particularly between cybernetic concepts and theological concepts. Thanks.
So if you stop sharing your slides for now.
Yeah.
And we say thank you very much to Keith for starting that off. There's already 2 hands up, which doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I've got only the usual 3.5, 4 pages of notes. So if we run out of questions from the floor, there will be plenty more, because I've got a couple of. So 2 things I want to say. Really, really interesting, your interpretation of VSM. So the 3, 4, 5, the managing the present, creating the future, nurturing identity, which we refer to as the better system. In Stafford's model, he referred to that as systems 3, 4, and 5. But actually, if you look,
have I got my systems numbers wrong? I have, haven't I?
Upside down. But I think that's quite sweet, because actually, when you look inside a system 1 has to have a system 3, 4, 5 in order to be a system 1. So however you label it, the idea was very nice for me. So I thoroughly enjoyed that particular bit. I also have much more so than I did when I was younger, a real appreciation of the extent to which Peter Checkland doesn't understand that soft system methodology is just cybernetics for behavior. And one day I'll persuade him that actually that's right. So I'm going to start with, I think, Janos. I think your hand went up first, but I'm guessing, and then I'll come to you, Pilar, and then Vanilla. So we've got three to get us going. So Janos first, please.
Right. Thank you very much. You are not you, but I'm talking to Keith Elford. You are engaged in a problem-solving situation, but you haven't got a methodical problem-solving method, and so you are sort of trying to feel your ways. Although problem solving is innate in the living sphere, we all do it all the time, but you need a methodical problem solving way, or a problem solving method. This VSM thing is not a problem solving method. It's a representation of some vague and inadequate structure. And if I may suggest that, and the other thing is, you referred to Checkland methodology, or SSM, which is a problem solving or an attempt at problem solving, but it is hasn't been taken up because it's extremely vague and difficult to employ. And for the last, these methods are over 70 years old, or 60 years old, or whatever it is. So it is a need to innovation, and especially concerning the relationship between problem solving and structure or the system. And if I may push my interest, I have just published a book after a lot of long time research in this business, which in fact deals with problem solving, and you might like to have a look at it. And as a matter of interest, during your speech, I identified the elements of this problem-solving scheme. So I could comment on that, but I don't want to prolong this.
So I think we can share the book title again. I'm actually just started reading it. I had to finish reading Keith's PhD first. So yeah, so that's really helpful. Pilar, if I've pronounced it right, you're on.
No, nobody does. Don't worry about it. Except, I got twigged on the question of the ontological existence of the church, of its own sense of what its ontology is, and I'd like you to expand on that, please, if you could, Keith. But first, I'll give the background of why it struck me. Is that if one has ontology where one presumes a particular reality, that this is what the world is, it's kind of in, not exactly in conflict with, but in not supported by the notion that everybody is different and everybody has their own experience, which is more of a transcendental, not transcendental ontology, but a sense of a constitutive ontology, that people can create their own worlds. So perhaps the question that becomes central here is not what is real, what is the true, but the question of trust, of how do we act with each other in trust of something that we do not understand, whatever that may be, something that beauty or harmony, or you may call it God.
Shall I try and respond to that?
Please.
I mean, quite a lot of my thesis is devoted to trying to establish the basis on which one might relate organization theory generally, but and more specifically cybernetics to a theological perspective on the world and a Christian theological perspective. And I think the view that I took and the view that I take is that the world cannot be seen purely theologically, as it were, or purely not theologically. That there is a sense in which a kind of transcendental or a kind of created reality kind of coexist, and that's the basis on which one could have an engagement between something we should quote scientific like organization theory generally, or cybernetics in particular, and something which has a kind of transcendental or at least based on a claim about a kind of transcendental reality, and that that there's a kind of interaction of what you might call more kind of theological and more pragmatic or practical or organizational factors in a reality like the church. I'm not sure how well that answers what you said, but I think that for me, the church is always a kind of human stroke theological reality at the same time.
I really appreciate that you gave me the phrase creative reality, which kind of fills in that living in that parallel of knowing we are responsible for our creations and can be creative. And that is not just what we construct, but who we are, in my view.
Thank you. And Vanilla, I think yours was the next hand. Thank you.
Hello there. Keith, that was edifying. Thank you. I have so many ideas in my head. I'll try and keep this logical. I must tell you that in my 40s and a late starter, I decided to do a degree in theology. I did a bachelor in theological studies at Greenwich. Now, everybody there, you're talking about getting people into the church, all the young people there, straight out of the sixth form or their gap year, they were looking to have a role in the church as monks, nuns, priests, what have you. And one by one, I was picking them off the floor in the toilets, sobbing their hearts out. I got two had to be sectioned. I mean, by the end of year one, there wasn't a middle-class white person still standing. The history of the church completely destroyed them. They knew nothing about it or about theology or anything, really. So they gradually knitted themselves back together, and I'm in touch with some of them, and they're teachers. They have productive lives within the Christian community. Excuse me. The rock solid were the black guys. They came over mostly from Africa. They needed degrees. So they were there, and I asked them how they coped with all of this, and they said, oh, that's white people's stuff. They didn't worry about it at all, which really helps me understand the growth of Christianity in Africa and other countries. The next thing I did was to do an MA in esotericism, which I have to say was a lot more fun than theology. And that got me into all sorts of strange places. One of which is to where I now live, which is in the shadow of Rennes-le-Château, where I don't know if you've read The Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Anyway, we call it Bonkers Central. Everything you've heard of that is slightly lunatic about contemporary theology happens here. It's wonderful. And I suspect all the people that have run away from Christianity have rooted themselves in all this alternative stuff. I'm sure you're familiar with it all. I mean, from alternative healing and homeopathy and yoga, God help us, and crystal twiddling and all that stuff. It all comes with a spiritual package, which is very seriously taken by this particular age group, and seems to be very widespread. I'm not sure if it's something in the water or if it's a genuine movement, and I really ought to try and chart it better, but life is short. I don't know if that's useful to a Christian to consider how to Christianize the new spirituality, which is based on the notion of the Christ, and looks at all the Gnostic Gospels, not the canonical ones, but certainly the Nag Hammadi texts, and especially the Magdalene. The women's movement in this kind of sub-Christian boat is spectacular. Anyway, I can go on about this forever, but I would like to say to you, you missed out something in the Protestant church in England that I found incredibly important, and that is the care they take of the poor. I mean, no social body does the work you lot do better than to house the homeless and to care for people in distress. I've seen it all over the place. It's remarkable, and you should big that up.
Well, thank you. I didn't. Thank you for that. I didn't want to boast, but especially as I can't take any personal credit for any of it. But it is true. Sorry,
Keith, that the church is what is left when all the buildings have gone, and that talks directly to, I think, Vanilla's point about what is it we're doing. Sorry, on with your answer.
I was just going to say that, I mean, that one of the things one can say about the Church of England is that it is still everywhere, and it's often the only agency still there, in some urban priority areas, for example, and in some rural areas too. And it is also true that quite a high percentage of the people of the kind of activities you were referring to are either directly sponsored by the church or supported by people who are churchgoers. So an awful lot of volunteering is, you can map onto church attendance. And in that sense, if the church were not there, it would be a very big, it would be a very big loss. Of course, the church is in practice hanging on in lots of places now, with very small numbers. But it is true that the church has a practical commitment to the well-being of its communities. That, of course, it's not unique to the church. There are plenty of other people, but it's the church that is the constant and consistent factor in lots of places. And so from that point of view, its loss would be very substantial.
Thanks, Keith. And Mr. Heald, would you care to reveal the Irish Sea out of your hotel room window? Or
I'm going to say, I assumed it was the Chris Heald I knew, but I haven't seen his face until now.
Well, my face was visible earlier. Hello, Keith. So I think I could kind of talk quite a while, but I think my question, Keith, really is about boundaries and the extent to which, when you were doing your work, you encountered boundaries, and which for me is a kind of key part of cybernetic world, because in a way you've chosen to look at the Church of England, but there's lots of other churches around the globe. Vanilla's hinted at some stuff, and there's plenty of other religions, and you could argue that the Church of England is a kind of fairly irrelevant structure in that whole piece, if you wanted to. So I'm wondering how much your work kind of bounced into the boundaries between different religions, and I also wonder about time boundaries, because you've talked as if the Church of England is, I mean, I like the sustainability piece, but actually in my view and experience of it, it's been many different entities over many different years. So, the Church of England today is definitely not what it was in Victorian times or the 50s. They're different entities. I think, there's not really a joined up history in some of that. So boundaries is my question, which I'd like you to comment on a bit, how much you bounced into them.
Well, I mean, part of the reality of doing a piece of research of the kind that involve, that a PhD involves, is you've got to narrow it down somehow to something that you can do. And
but that's the cybernetics almost works against that. So anyway, that's
arguably it was still too broad, because it involved doing lots of things that
Oh, is he going to come back, or we're going to have to answer his question for him? We can be pretty sure he is not frozen in time and space. It is merely the internet that is playing up. So
I didn't know I was going to have that impact.
It obviously encountered a disruption in the space-time continuum, Chris, that you've created by the invention of a boundary. So let's see if let's give him a minute and see if he comes back in. It's you did try and talk just then, didn't he?
Suspended animation.
So we've got to see. I hope he comes back. Yeah, he certainly does, Robin. We've just lost. So have we lost him? No, he's still there. Is he? Oh, there you are, Keith. You're back.
I'm back.
You're out of sync. Your mouth is out of sync with your noise is out of sync with your pictures. But try and answer the question if you can. I mean, I think you kind of have to narrow it down a bit on the thing about the church changing. I mean, I think it is true, of course, that the church has changed, and that the church as one sees it now is in many ways not the same church as existed in the 50s or 60s or even in the 70s. At one level, you could talk about, I mean, the services have all changed, for example. Whereas in the 60s, probably most churches were still using the Book of Common Prayer. It was a 16th, 17th century product. It's been modern language for some time, and they've been through various iterations of that. As is the way with society more generally, manners have changed quite a bit, and the way that people interact has changed a certain amount. And there are many churches have different styles of service and so on. I think at that level the church has changed quite a lot. I'm less convinced it's changed more fundamentally. I think in the way that people think about it and interact. I think that particularly in the Church of England, the implications of moving from, a long phase of a kind of Christendom model, where the church has a certain privileged role in society, which makes it likely will be pretty widely supported. The challenge of moving from that to a situation where the church increasingly does not have that kind of status. I mean, technically it probably still does, but in practice it doesn't really. And I think the church has been very slow to respond to that reality. And I think that's a more fundamental issue than, because I think the changes that have taken place are relatively superficial. Is that, Keith, because I've got conscious there are 5 questions waiting for him. Is that because the actors within the church are pursuing their ends rather than those of the church itself, or indeed God?
I think my view, I mean, there are lots, I mean, everybody's got their own ends, haven't they? And that's, sin is always with us. But I think the church lacks the capacity to think about this kind of transformation. I think that my own view is that the extent of the social change that's taken place in the last 50 or 60 years has exceeded the church's capacity to respond, because it's just too big a change compared with what the church had been used to before that. I don't think, I mean, at a certain superficial level, or a more superficial level, there has been quite a lot of change and the church is reasonably good at it. But I think in terms of reassessing more fundamental issues, it has not found that at all easy.
Okay, thank you. Joran, is it Joran we pronounce it? I'm never sure.
Yes, although I pronounce it as Goran, although in different cultures it's actually pronounced in many different ways. So I'm fine with either. Well, first of all, thank you so much for a great presentation. It's so interesting, and as many of our colleagues, I have a lot of thoughts and ideas and questions. I'll build on what Pile talked about, and I quickly jotted down the statement that I hope correctly, not just what we construct by who we are. And something that made me think, it reflected on something that I was reflecting on throughout this talk, which is what happens in the Enlightenment, you know, and how that might have affected our relationship with spirituality and what we perceive as potentially the divine or at least transcendental. And certainly the Enlightenment, you know, I mean, obviously, as we know, it promised a kind of a rational universe of objective truth that's universally shared. And we kind of went happily along with that for a while, but then both modern physics and kind of literature revealed more constructed views of reality in recent decades. And it seems that we're kind of struggling to reconcile these ideas. You know, is the universe truly objective, or is it actually constructed, which is kind of what I heard in Pile's, you know, comment. And, you know, some kind of today popular explorations that are perhaps problematic are that, well, there's no objective truth, you know, some claim. We're kind of in a post-truth world, which is an interesting position. And one wonders whether cybernetics might offer a kind of a more helpful or unique way of considering these constructivism, whether through, you know, the lens of radical constructivism, von Glaserfeld, or something like that, because we civilizationally seem to be having kind of a difficulty with reconciling what we once believed to be true in the Enlightenment and what we're now discovering in this kind of age of relativism. So it's just my kind of first point. My second one is around Keith's point. I think, Keith, you mentioned Weber in your presentation, and that immediately brings to mind the kind of Weber's instrumental rationality, which is kind of scarily prescient, you know, part of Weber. And one wonders what role the church might play, you know, in kind of reconstructing our notion of value rationality, because, you know, for example, the modern social media platforms have played quite expertly into the instrumental rationality by using the cybernetic loops to feed us into kind of, to quote my professor Giselle Argyle in Romanticism, instrumental rationality is that which renders everything calculated and calculable, so that pictures, family life, whatever, you know, it starts looking as a kind of transactional, something transactional. And yet when we look at for example, instances of mental health, you know, issues that are rising in the world globally, it would seem that we crave for the value rationality that unfortunately, you know, back to Weber's argument, seems to be disappearing. So one wonders whether cybernetics might offer a way of, again, our colleagues talked about ontological, of kind of analyzing what's happening ontologically, and could we somehow build our way back to some sort of perception of the value rationality, whether it's divine or transcendental or whatever, because we seem to need it on some level. I'll just pause there.
Thank you. That to me is an intriguing and helpful set of comments. I mean, I took the view in the work that I would combine what I took to be. I mean, obviously there isn't one theological, you know, view of the world, but you know, one has to define one's theological view of the world. And I took a kind of view on the relationship between the uncreated and the created, which I saw as having real affinities with a critical realist position on the world, where which to put it really crudely is there is a kind of objective reality, but our perception of it is critically limited in various ways, those two things. It was partly that allowed me to bring together some of these different components, these theological and organizational components, because the principal objection of people in the church or theologians to organization theory is its perceived too great a depth to the perspective of the Enlightenment. In other words, it flattens reality. It denies any kind of mystery, or it denies the spiritual, and it's overly functional in that rather negative sense of the word functional. That it denies too much of our existence. And there's most of the objections to organizational perspectives amongst theological writers takes that sort of line. It's really an objection to the Enlightenment, actually, or that's obviously that what kind of gives rise to it. So I find critical realist perspectives very helpful, because to my mind, it allows me to accept the limits on our perspective and our understanding and our knowledge, whilst not regarding that kind of strictly scientific perspective as the kind of last or only word. And it allows, and to my mind, it has a very natural, people may object, but I saw it as having a very natural fit with a kind of theological perspective which understands us as created beings, and therefore as created beings we are not God, and we only have a limited perspective by virtue of our createdness. So I found what I felt was quite a natural fit between that kind of the critical realist position and a sort of theological position, and that it's really that allowed me to bring together the theological and the organizational perspectives provided by cybernetics and others, but cybernetics principally.
Thanks, Keith. Alan.
Thank you.
You call me John?
Yes, you, then Robin, then Elena, then Pilar and Janos. So you're going to keep you going, Keith. You're going to earn your fee.
I know. I've got 2 hours to drive yet.
Right, away you go.
Keith Arendt here in Switzerland.
Yeah.
A Dutchman in Switzerland. Studying.
Hi.
Actually, I started finally in my old age, a PhD study on the functionality of living systems, the criteria for that. Now, when I look at that study, the research I've done the last few years, then the Church of England does not comply to these criteria of functionality for the long term. Because, as I say, it's becoming too complex to regulate it. Complexity cannot be regulated, it must be steered, and the cybernetic principle is steering with information, right?
Yeah.
Now, when you have, but then you have to see that all information, of course, is used. And I don't think in theological matters, all information is used, because that would mean that, theologic is against reality sometimes. And reality is truth. So truth must be a criteria for functionality. That's what I wanted to say. So if you look at it from the seek knowledge of causes school of Athens idea, then you can say, okay, we have to rebuild the church with those criteria, and then maybe embrace a better message that will attract, audiences. And that audience would, I think, must be that you can consider Gnosticism as a way to attract people, because Gnosticism is about knowledge, is about inner knowledge. And then you also attract the spiritual people to go to the Church of England. So a few things that I, analyze from this, from your presentation, maybe, something to think about. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think I want to say that, a theology which is totally divorced from, other disciplines and realities, is not a very helpful theology. I mean, there are those, even within the church, who regard a kind of theological perspective as so radically different from other more, let's call them broadly scientific perspectives, that the two can't really meet. That's not my view. I take the view that whatever reality is, there can only really be ultimately be one of it, and that there must be different ways of looking at it. So I tend to take the view that although I'm naturally, as a Christian believer, I feel compelled to regard my particular theological perspective as kind of decisive in certain matters. Nevertheless, I only see it as one perspective on a complex reality, and it's really on that basis that I'm able to bring together a theological perspective and a cybernetic or other forms of, it's not the only organizational perspective I consider, but it's the principal one. I'm able to bring those two together because I see those as different lenses through which to approach, a reality which is in a sense mysterious and in a certain way somewhat unknowable. But so I would say there are different lenses. At a certain level, as I'm suggesting, I'm bound to see theology as decisive. But I see it's part of a total picture.
Yeah, I can only react that I see through the lens of information, especially for my research study.
Cool.
And,
Robin.
And I think that the information, the information deficit you're dealing having to deal with in reality, in real life by perception, is maybe causing the entropy, the disorder that into this destabilization and disorganization. And that is what I find in my research, that happens when the maximum amount of questions, as von Hoyster said, is not being asked.
If that has the kind of sense of the theology has to engage, in order to be sustainable, the theological perspective has to engage with the full reality of what's going on in the world from a whole load of other perspectives today. I can only agree with you. I don't think there's any future in theology as a kind of discipline that floats above everything else, pretending that nothing else matters. There has to be, I'm trying to occupy a position where I'm saying, on the one hand, in the sense that we all have to approach anything from some sort of position. I feel I have to approach reality from a theological position because that embodies my most fundamental commitments. But at the same time, I have to be engaged in a genuine dialogue with all these other disciplines. And in principle, that my theological principles should be questionable in the light of those engagements. So so I'm trying to occupy a position where I occupy my ground with a degree of confidence, whilst being open to discovering I'm wrong.
That's a good point of balance.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. I won't take more time.
Robin.
Thank you, Keith. I'd like to refocus on the church VSM, and if Posiwin, purpose of the system is what it does. The church has undergone many changes, a lot of autopoiesis in the centuries, and is now doing something. What is the current purpose of the church? What is it there for? And is the actual what it's doing aligned to what it thinks it's doing. And therefore, it is, for me, the big weakness is the system 4, the looking at the emergent environment, the changing environment, and I identify as one of those who has absolutely no religion whatsoever. I'm not here to do any church bashing. I'd like to look at it objectively through the VSM. So is the system 4 of the church filtering through its theological eyes the reality of what's happening in the environment? And is that the weakness, where it's not adapting to the environment, and therefore is it going to be a viable system in the future?
I'm still marking slightly from having got my system with the numbers wrong earlier on, but
creating the future, Keith, creating the future.
Yeah, I think that I would argue that the church, if the church is not able to engage both with the reality of what's going on in the world and the truth about itself, that it is in real danger of not moving forward in any way. And I think the autopoiesis point is very well made, and I would take it. I mean, I think that it is a real issue in the church as I know it, and that is principally the Church of England, not only but principally, that there isn't a hugely, it's not brilliant at having a kind of perspective on itself. And so a lot does happen that isn't questioned, and an awful lot is about replicating, you know, the kind of thing that already is, rather than reinterpreting the identity in the light of the reality. Yeah.
Is the future of the church perhaps in communities? As you said, you know, you do so much to help the poor and commitment to well-being of communities. You're losing the communities in England. Perhaps the Church of England should be the International Church of England and look at the African nations who are just sweeping up religion, and that's where you should be actually looking to survive as an organisation.
Intervene at this point, gentlemen.
The missionaries.
Your attention, a small tome that I came across a little while ago, a book called "Creating the Future of the Church," written by a certain Keith Elford before he was a doctor. Let's call it a reflection on the state of the church. What was that, Keith? Now 8-9 years ago, before you really started on the research. So he has got System 4 kind of nailed in here, and if we were being polite about it, they're not very good at it. Can I bring in Elena, Keith? She's been waiting a long while to have a go at you, or not? Elena, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'm concerned about how the System 5 of the Church of England manages to fit within the System 5s of other aspects of Christianity, which also applies to other religions, where you have very progressive social and humanitarian and ecological positions on the one hand, and you have others that deny science, human rights, and basically are authoritarian on the other. How do these manage not to split the church at the System 5 of Christianity?
Yeah, well, it remains to be seen. I suppose is in a sense the situation, but I do find it quite distressing from a personal point of view how kind of, you know, reactionary elements, I would regard them as, in the church, are able to kind of justify their position theologically. I think, in my view, that it's a battle that people who understand the church as a kind of agent of enlightened and appropriate change in the world needs to win. But I agree, it's a problem that if one is looking at the church institutionally, and you want to reform it, and you would think in kind of cybernetics terms that some kind of shared clarity around organizational identity and meaning is a kind of requisite of that, then it's problematic that there are in many churches, although it varies a lot around the place. It's not quite so dramatic in England as it is in the States. But the fact that there are very contradictory views on the matters you raise, I think it's a real problem, and I hope it's resolvable. I don't know that it is.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for a very fine presentation.
Thank you.
Matthew, you're up next. Now, I will say at this point that Matthew is at the beginning of the journey that you've just completed.
Oh, is he? Yeah, well, I'm just living proof you do get there one day. I was 20 when I started. Yeah. Sorry, man. I'll shut up.
That's all right. So I don't know too much about the church. I'm one of the young people in that 55% of one of your first slides.
Yeah.
That would probably consider themselves atheist. But I was wondering if a lot of the decline is related to just keeping up with technology. So I think if you want to reach people, you're going to have to physically reach them. And now every day has gone technology and on the phone and apps and social media. I wonder if they should increase their presence on those kind of things to kind of engage with a new audience, for one, especially the younger audience. But then also using technology within the church to within their organization to sort out communication and things. I don't know how much they use that currently, but maybe they could improve using better organization of how those three hierarchies you showed could talk to each other and manage things.
Yeah. That's an interesting, I think at the level of, at the everyday level, the church isn't too bad at some of those things. In the sense that every church has got, every church has got a website. Every church, some of them are not very good, but a lot of them are a lot of them are quite good now. And every church has got, got used to doing services by Zoom and on YouTube and so on during the pandemic, so I think at the kind of local, and lots of meetings take place online. There's at one level it's not too bad at all that now. I think where your question raises an interesting point is more to do with as I think you clearly meant, the communication between the church at the various levels I talked about. I think that might have a part to play, because I would say that's where, if I need to talk to the archdeacon, who is a kind of intermediary between me and the bishop, if you like. I probably would do that by Zoom or something. But in general, I don't think we make much of the potential of modern communication technology in relation to these different levels of the church. I think that there are some real possibilities in that, but I think that would have to support the will, A, and B, a kind of understanding. And I'd argue for getting much clearer about what we should be trying to do at these various different kind of levels in the organization, and not to try and you know, because the danger of what's been happening in recent times is that the people who are at this national level, you know, are trying to legislate for what happens at every level of the church. And the only way they can do that is through measures that are arguably inadequate or irrelevant, really, which is kind of slightly my verdict on renewal and reform. So, I mean, well, most of the things in it are not, you know, I don't like all of them, but they're not terrible. They're okay. But my point is they're not going to make the difference that everybody hopes that they will make, because they won't have the impact on the wider organization that they hope for. Because nobody owns it, nobody understands it, and it's not, they don't really touch the big issues anyway.
Is it
Yeah.
an illusion in there, Keith, that because you talked about it a couple of times early on, and it does play the whole structured autonomy of the church. So you as parish priest, you know, pretty broad boundaries, picking up Chris's point, bishop even broader boundaries, and so on. And is it that you know, you're out there in the parish doing your interpretation of God's work, but somebody in Westminster is kind of sitting there trying to direct what it is that they think you should be doing in order not just to do God's work, but also to bring God's people into the church and frankly collect money, sort of treating it as a bit of a business in that respect, rather than a mission-driven activity?
Yeah, I think that is broadly quite close to what I'm was regarding as a kind of failure of the way things are working. I mean, there isn't an absolutely appropriate role for people in more, quote, senior, parts of the church. And it's not that the whole mission and activity of the church takes place at the local level, but that is where most of it takes place. And the question should be probably rather more, how can we understand that in a way that allows that to flourish, rather than try and produce the kind of solutions. It's like, it's a little bit like reform of the NHS. What can you do from the centre? Well, you can do this, that, and the other. But does that? But you can. I don't know. You can change. You can change whether they're individual trusts or they're responsible to to some kind of local area health authority or something. Those are the kinds of changes that get made, aren't they? But
so I'm going to link this to another one of your threads, because what you're describing in a sense is, if you're busy doing church out in the grim the grim suburban Surrey, and I'm the Archbishop of Canterbury, which would make everybody laugh, not least the Archbishop of Canterbury. What's the job of the Archbishop? Is it to do God, or is it to do leadership as a service? And so then you're thinking about, so the role of the Archbishop is to enable the work of God at the parish level, ultimately. Creating the conditions under which you as vicar can succeed in seducing people into God's ways of being and doing the things that God would have us do, rather than directing and controlling. So because when we talk about leadership in terms of a cybernetic organization, there's a huge difference between the control and direction and the language we might use around that, and the leadership as a service enabling.
Yeah, I think that is. That is pretty close to the issue as I see it. So what happens is that the current Archbishop and some other senior clerics, dreadfully and rightfully, I think, very concerned about the situation. They know what needs to happen. We need to be much more. They think we need to be much more. We need to be much more out there and converting the people. Basically, that's what they think. Partly because of the school of thought represented by the Archbishop, and so they want that to happen. They can't make it happen, but they that's the kind of atmosphere that they create, and they're trying to encourage. And they think, what measures can we actually control that might make that that might support that. And those are the things they do. What they don't think about is how can we enable the local churches to kind of flourish in a slightly broader, in a broader understanding of what that might look like. And for that reason, I don't think it'll work. That's not least.
So is there something that gets embedded in that then that is about, because you started right at the beginning with this question of purpose and identity. So when I observe, the purpose of a system is what it does. What it does is done by system one, but also it's observer defined. So when I look at, when I observe the church, what I'm observing is the work of the church and the impact it has on the community in which I might exist, or the communities in which I might exist. But if that purpose identity are not clear and explicit, if it all gets a bit woolly or a bit unclear, does that not act as a mechanism that detracts from the ability of the church to if you like, attract punters, which ultimately it needs to do?
No, I agree with that. I think part of the problem is that the church is overly concerned about doing things which it thinks will preserve the church, rather than doing things which will allow the church to fulfill its role, its proper role in society. I would prefer personally to say that we need to get out there and do what we're there to do in our communities, which is in the broadest sense, love them. But that means, that probably means do things which benefit the community and be a spiritual focus for the community. Yes, of course I think it's perfectly appropriate to try and engage people in becoming, participants in this activity, of course. But I think if you make that the only activity, and you do it because you're worried that you're going down the pan, then I think you undermine something fundamental about who you are.
It's like businesses who focus on money because they want to make more of it.
Exactly.
Rather than focus on, what they're there to do, the people are there to serve, etc., and the money will come as a result.
Exactly. That's exactly. And I might even say that somewhere in the thesis. I can't remember, but it was certainly in my mind, Chris. And of course, that arises from our common conversation in Telos Partners back in the day.
Can you differentiate then the delivery of what the church is there to do, which may be this commitment to well-being of the community, from the religious aspects of what the church does to organize itself?
I think in a sense you can. I mean, not least in the sense that anything that's done for the good of the community is done in a sense unconditionally. I mean, it's not done on the basis that we're only going to do this if you give us a certain kind of response. It's done because it's good, or because we care about it. I think you have to have some confidence, looking at it from the point of view of the church, that if you do those things, there will be, some things will happen which will allow you to continue, but and allow the church to be sustained. But I think as soon as you start worrying about, as soon as you make that your big driver, you undermine the whole thing. You've got to be doing it because it's the right thing to do, and kind of unconditionally.
So is the church too busy sustaining itself to be itself?
Yeah, I think that's a real danger. Yeah. That's not universally true, of course, but I do think it's a real current temptation, to use a theological term.
Nothing like a temptation on Wednesday night, is there? anybody was sitting there with a question waiting to be asked? I have many, but I'm also conscious we've had you on the stage now for an hour and a half solid, Keith, without a tea break or even a bun. What do you think, Mr. Randall? Are you brought with question or?
I don't have a question. This has been fascinating because I guess I've knocked around the spiritual space in the broadest sense since my 20s. I'm a regular churchgoer, but not confirmed. My husband's a Catholic. And as you can imagine, we go to.
Oh, well, that would create a few challenges. Yeah, I can see. Yeah.
Because he's a member of, well, he's actually on the National Committee of Quest, which is a gay Catholic organisation not recognised by the Vatican. And I find it fascinating. He once described it to me as, in Catholicism, there's no pretense of democracy, which sort of gives you a latitude to make your own mind upon things. So I know that's not how Catholicism practiced everywhere, but it is fascinating how organizations with a spiritual human mission then grapple with all the kind of organizational stuff that many of us are familiar from commercial contexts. So it's almost like if I just took the Church of England, we go to an inclusive Church of England church, and even there you've got a whole spectrum of inclusive church, very positive on LGBTQI, and you've got the evangelical churches where we get a lot of people who are basically refugees. So we are actually providing refuge for people from another part of the same organization.
Yeah. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot there, Jonathan. I think I mean, of course, there's one of the biggest live issues. Of course, in the church, and you're partly describing, I think, the a fault line that runs through the church between those who think that truth is something that continues to be discovered, and those who think that there is a kind of final list represented in some kind of reading of scripture or something. And that is those are big challenges in the churches. I think finding ways. I mean, it's about. I mean, I think in cybernetics terms, isn't it? I think it's about disentangling, the core identity, the kind of core purpose from a whole set of accretions, which grow up over organizations. And I mean, I'm inclined to the view that organizations have a kind of, purpose that's permanent, but it has to be defined in a way that allows you to discover new things about it. Yes. And that's, your experience and your situation would be absolutely in that category for me. We're still discovering what it means. Yes. And I think you've got to have that perspective. But as we said, there are plenty of people in church organizations who take the view that it's not just that. I would say that they're mistaking a particular version of the faith for God, as it were. That's what I'd say. I'd say you've got to be constantly asking yourself, is this particular view that you have a kind of time-bound accretion or is it something really truly core? And that's a fault line that runs right. Different views on that run right through Christianity, and I think it makes the kind of reform that a proper reform and renewal, if you like, very difficult, very challenging.
Yeah, because if I compared, say, my place Rolls-Royce, people may disagree on the how. Pretty aligned on the what and the why. We want to make jet engines and keep our customers happy. But there might be huge debates and disagreements about the how. Do we do this project? Do we do this technology? That kind of stuff. What they're now observing, even in the local diocese, where we had a in the Anglican Church, an evangelical bishop, and a very out dean of the cathedral. And what a sense of the really strained working relationship, but that the fundamental disagreement felt like the what and the why, probably a lot of agreement on the how. So it's very kind of different where the fault lines occurred in an organization with a kind of spiritual human purpose versus one which is a kind of commercial purpose.
Yeah, there's a lot more complexity, I think, around those questions, and also the stakes are kind of higher as well for people. You know, they're more fundamental. They're, you know, right? If you're not, if you don't like, you know, Rolls Royce's, you know, purpose, you go work somewhere else, don't you? But
yes.
church is a bit more problematic because it has a different, you know, it aspires and expects a different kind of loyalty.
Yes.
And most of these issues are live issues in most churches. I mean, you know, it's not as if there's a church over there called one which agrees with all the things which I think are right. You know, it's problematic. But I mean, I will say, and this is, I will say in defense of the church that this occurs not just because the church is full of, you know, it's full of reactionary people who with unenlightened views. It happens because the church at least aspires to represent a much broader section of society,
yeah.
And therefore, you know, these issues, which are issues in society, are acutely felt in the church.
Yes,
and that's the church's difficulty.
Yeah,
and I intrude, Goran, and we're going to give Goran the pleasure of the last question of the night. How about that?
Wow, well, thank you for that honor. I'm not certain I'm deserving of it, but I'll try to make it count. I truly appreciated these wonderful questions in the discourse. I have more of a technical question. I'm not certain, and I apologize, whether it has a great deal to do with cybernetics, although now listening to all of you, I'm starting to think that it might. I'm not certain if you've come across the work of René Girard and his concept of mimesis and his theory around how society is formed and why society is the way it is. And for those of you that, I'm just going to put it in the post, for those of you that might not have seen it, but Girard has this position that claims that societies get formed because we're lacking some kind of a fundamental connection with something. We don't know what it is. We feel a kind of a gap in our being, and to compensate for this gap, we try to find it in our neighbor, as it were. And we basically sort of take on, you know, these properties of our neighbor, whatever it might be, through this mimetic process. And Girard argues that this is what forms societies. And then he takes a very interesting leap from that to the Christ and sort of says, well, the Christ kind of liberates us from this mimetic desire and what he calls the process of scapegoating, because we have to, when things go wrong, we kind of have to find someone to blame and to make guilty in the society. How do you feel about this if you've come across it, and what are your thoughts on something like this?
Well, I think I would say that the church is a kind of, I mean, from my perspective, the church is a kind of, you know, spiritual, social kind of reality. So it has that about it which if you like, transcends the everyday, and that about it which is absolutely rooted and absolutely of the everyday. And in that sense, it is a kind of odd hybrid. And that's why I would always say the church is never less than an organization, but it's always more as well. So that's why I would say that church has to engage with organizational theoretical categories, but not be dictated by them either. I think that, and that's because I think the church has something of the nature of, well, obviously of Christ himself, who is understood to be, you know, incarnate. And I think that's, I mean, obviously Girard understands that a bit differently from the way I would, but, you know, it's a similar sort of concept that Christ is at once in the world and at the same time kind of not. You know, that there's something else going on there. And you know, that, and there are those in theology who strongly emphasize that kind of transcendent side, and those who strongly emphasize the incarnated side. And then there are people like me who want to try and say both are true, and approach, you know, and say that, you know, there is an appropriate relationship between theology and organization theory, even if it creates a few problematic areas, because these things are not a neat fit. You know, we are talking about, if there's any truth in it at all, we're talking about, you know, earthly categories and transcendent categories, and obviously they, you know, they raise all kinds of problems.
So if Stafford is to be believed, and I very much believe that he should be, he presented an argument, Cybernetics and Management 1959, when I was but one, and subsequently in various tomes on the shelf behind me, that argued for the principles of an organization that if it wished to be viable, it must adopt. It said nothing of the nature of the organization in terms of whether it was doing God's work or the devil's work, frankly. It just, if it doesn't follow these rules, it won't survive. And they're pretty broad and flaky set of rules in many respects. But in order for the church to be a church, it must necessarily be organized, so therefore it's an organization. But the organization mustn't get in the way of it doing the jobs that it's supposed to do, and that's a really interesting tension, because we can lift it straight out of we can take the church out of that statement and insert Rolls-Royce or the policing service or the army, and find we get to exactly the same thing. And the organizations would work so much better if they weren't populated with people, wouldn't they? Because it's very easy to espouse the sort of organizational purpose and mission and all the rest of it, and then we lump a bunch of human beings into the middle with free will, and that really sort of kind of screws things up for us. Keith, that has been, when we spoke at 3 o'clock or whatever it was, you were concerned that there might not be enough material to keep us going. If it wasn't tea time, I suspect we could keep on going for several more hours with this, because there's just so much in it. I've really enjoyed it. I want to say thank you very much. I know it took us a while to get there, but a really, really good session. I've recorded nearly all of it. I may come back to you and want to re-record the first sort of 15-20 minutes because I forgot to do it for that, but we will get it. But it's been a great discussion, really, really enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.